Okay, hi, so in this video we're going to speak a bit about inheritance. Now, inheritance is of course a massive topic. It's its own field really in biology, genetics, and inheritance basically tells us how and why we obtain characteristics from our parents. So when you have a look at children and you can see similarities between a child and his mother and its father, the reason why there are those similarities are because of inheritance. And inheritance really stems from the fact that we are a result of fertilization of a sperm from our father and an egg from our mother. Now these aren't drawn to scale of course, but you get the idea. So we have sperm plus egg is going to equal an embryo, which will eventually form a human being. So there we go, sperm plus the egg is going to eventually form an embryo that looks something like this. Now, the sperm and the egg are collectively known as gametes. Gametes. And gametes is just a word for sex cells. So the female sex cell is the egg, or the ovum, it's sometimes called, and the male sex cell is the sperm. Now, each one of our egg and our sperm contain half the amount of DNA which is needed for a full human being. For example, every single one of my skin cells contains all the DNA which makes up me, but the sperm cells that I'll produce only contain half the amount of DNA. So therefore, when you mix that with a female who produces half of her DNA in an egg, then you reproduce a full amount of DNA. But half of it has come from the mother and half of it has come from the father. But what exactly is that genetic material? Well, of course, the genetic material we're talking about here is DNA. So DNA. And of course, DNA you'll often see drawn like this, and this is actually true. We've got loads of tiny little atoms and molecules here being joined up together to make this massive ladder. Now, this DNA doesn't just float around like this in our cells. If we make this DNA very small, so we have very tiny amounts of DNA here, but millions of those put together. So this is only a small amount of DNA, so millions of those will be packaged together. So let's say we've got a tiny thing here, which when you zoom in looks like that. So a tiny amount, all put together, will end up looking like this. Now this is a pair of chromosomes. Chromosomes. And this is how DNA is found in our cell, in chromosomes. This is a pair of chromosomes, but DNA is packaged into these structures. Now, in humans, we have 23 of these pairs. So we have 23 pairs, or that means, of course, 46 chromosomes. So 46 individual chromosomes. And remember I said we get half from the mother, half from the father. That means we get 23 chromosomes from the sperm and 23 chromosomes from the egg. Now, this amount of chromosomes is for human beings. Different organisms contain different amounts of chromosomes. And this is a result of this ladder here being twisted round and compressed and forming the chromosomes. Now, this structure, I'd like to mention, is known as a double helix. Double helix because it's like two rungs of a ladder which twist around each other. So helix is where they're twisting around, and double is because you have two of these strands. Now, each chromosome contains a large number of what we call genes. Genes. Now, depending on the chromosome, it contains different amounts. The smallest is probably around about 10, and the largest will contain thousands of genes in a row. We've got around about 30,000 genes that we know of so far in our chromosomes. Now, each gene is basically just a stretch of DNA. So it's not anything separate to what we've already seen. it's just a way of grouping it. So a stretch of DNA is a gene, and that stretch of DNA encodes a particular characteristic. Okay. For example, let's say I had this blue section here. This blue section may code for hair color. And that means that this stretch of DNA will tell your body, basically, what color hair that you are going to have. And so if I had the gene for blonde hair, then I would be a blonde-haired person. If I had the gene for brown hair, then of course I would have brown hair. It's slightly more complicated than that because we actually have two versions of each gene. So we have two versions. And that makes sense because we get one from the mum and one from the dad. So your mother gives you one and your father gives you one. And we can see that in this diagram because look, on this side, so this chromosome, we have exactly the same gene. So this, I'm just going to write HC, that's the hair colour gene, and let's say that was from our dad. HC here, this is exactly the same hair colour gene, and that was from our mum. And when it gets interesting is when your mum might give you a blonde gene, but your dad might give you the brown gene. And then there are specific ways in which our body basically decides which hair colour we're going to have, and this goes for all different characteristics. And this is a very interesting sector of biology, and you'll study how this is done. So you'll study patterns of inheritance in your second unit in additional science. Now, importantly here, I have simplified this by saying that this gene tells you exactly what hair colour you're going to have. Some characteristics, including hair colour, are not so simple, and there might be more than one gene which control them. For example, something which is quite dramatic is height. So you'll often see a pattern that the height of a person is often dictated by the height of their parents. So if someone has really short parents, then they're probably going to be really short themselves. However, there is always going to be variation in that. Sometimes the firstborn son will often be taller than the parents, whereas other times they will not. And so there must be more than one thing going on there. And there is, and it turns out that there are loads of different genes which affect your height, and also your environment will affect your height as well. So if you eat right, then you've got the right opportunity to grow. If you don't, then you won't grow as effectively. So you need to realise that some characteristics are not as simple as being coded by one gene. Sometimes more than one gene codes for a characteristic. Okay, so I want to show you one more diagram which sums up really what we've spoke about in this video. So here we can see at the start what we know as DNA. So this is DNA. We have our two rungs of our double helix here. So this is like the ladder. And so that is a DNA. I'm going to write double helix there just to stress it. So we have a DNA double helix. Okay, and I could say that this section of DNA here, because this is more than just a tiny little bit of DNA, this is quite a large section, this may be a gene. Okay, it's still DNA, it's just a larger part of your DNA. So lots of this grouped together, which codes for a characteristic, is going to be your gene. And now the entire thing, the genes all joined together, will make up a chromosome. And these chromosomes are what is found in the nucleus of your cells. So your cells will have these chromosomes inside them, and they are stored in the nucleus. Now the chromosome, the gene, and the DNA are not separate things. The DNA makes up genes, and genes make up chromosomes. You could also say that DNA directly makes up chromosomes, because that's true as well. This is just a hierarchy of the size that we are talking about. So don't get confused with genes, chromosomes, and DNA, thinking that they are very separate things. DNA is the molecule. It makes up genes and it makes up chromosomes. It's just a gene codes for a characteristic, and a chromosome is how they are stored in the cell. But it's all the same thing. Okay, so we're going to stop there. That was just a brief overview. I hope that has made some sense. If you do have any questions, then please do comment them in the box below or send me an email using the link, and I look forward to speaking to you in the next video.